Wow, well, it is part 20. Oh my goodness, here we are ending Armin Navabi's book. Chapter 20, how can we really know anything? How do we know what we know? Can our beliefs be justified, specifically religious beliefs? Can we justify, give reason for belief in God or other beliefs that we may hold, or maybe a lack of belief? How do we understand our beliefs? Can we really know anything? This is a fun way to end this book and end the year. I can't believe it's December. The year is almost over. I only have one stream left this year, and it is going to be the end of the year Q&A next Tuesday. And I'm going to be addressing your questions, your comments, your calls. I'm also going to be telling you a little bit about what the show is going to look like next year and what to expect in 2025. And so it's going to be fun. But hey, this is the end of this book. I can't believe I started this book in January thinking it wasn't going to take the whole year, but it kind of got spread out, and hopefully it was good. Hopefully you enjoyed this series. If you're just joining for the very first time, well, this is part 20 of a series walking through Atheist Armin Navabi's book, Why There Is No God, 20 simple responses to 20 common arguments for the existence of God. And so these are common arguments that Armin has heard or has found online in his research, and he is offering his thoughts against all 20 of these arguments. And so I spent this entire year, 2024, walking through this book, part by part, chapter by chapter, looking at each of these arguments. And here we are, part 20. How can we really know anything? Can we prove what really is true? So, hey, it's been fun. My name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well, the show that is designed to train you to think well about the Christian faith as well as the culture, so you can engage the culture well. As a Christian, we are called to be ambassadors of Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians 5:20 talks about that we are God's ambassadors, that we are making his appeal through, he is making his appeal through us. And so if I am an ambassador, then I need to have knowledge of God, but I also have to have knowledge of culture. And I think this is true of all Christians, that we are called ambassadors. Therefore, there's this dual kind of focus of knowledge of God, knowledge of culture, so that we can engage the culture well. And so that is what my show hopefully does, is I address a wide range of issues. And again, next week, I'm going to tell you about a few different book studies I want to do next year. I really enjoyed this format of starting with the first 30 minutes, discussing a book, and then opening it up to your calls, your questions, your objections, and your thoughts, and kind of modeling conversations, both Christians calling in and answering questions, as well as atheists who have questions that want to call in. It has been fun. And so I want to continue this with a couple different books. So if you want to join me for a book study in 2025, I'm going to be walking through a few books that I will talk about next week. It'd be fun for you to purchase that book, read it one chapter at a time with me, come with questions, objections, and thoughts based on it as we kind of walk through these different books together. As well as, if you have a book that you want to recommend, please shoot me a message, whether on social media at RyanPauly3 is my handle there. You can email, I think, info@think-well.org. You can email me there. And I would love to walk through any sort of book that you think is better or good, or a different topic that you want to think about. There's always floating around in my head, what book should we talk about next? Now, before we jump into chapter 20, I do want to make sure and just make a quick announcement. Again, this is the end of the year. It is December, and we are closing out the year, which means we have our year-end challenge. A group of generous donors have pledged $14,000 towards our 2025 budget. So we are fully funded for 24. I was able to fundraise our complete budget. And so everything that we raise now will go to kind of seed 2025 to help propel this work forward. So if you have learned from this show, if you have benefited from this show, if you think this is a valuable thing just to learn and walk through these different topics, as well as have conversations with atheists and skeptics and Christians that call in, and you say, hey, this is something valuable that I want to make sure keeps happening. I want to give back. I would so greatly appreciate that. We're trying to match that 14,000 with another 14 by the end of the year. I think we're at like 18% right now, which is insane to think about. Here we are at the beginning, and we're about 18% matched. But that means we have about 72%. Did I do a math? 82%. 82% left that we are trying to raise. So if you want to jump on board and help contribute to this work and contribute to this show, you can go to think-well.org/donate, and you can get more information there. So with that being said, Thanks for being here. I want to engage your questions. So as always, if you have questions or objections based on things that I say, post them in the live chat, and I want to walk through those, maybe as we walk through this or even at the end, as well as you can click the link that I posted there and call into the show. So final chapter, chapter 20, Armin Navabi addresses this question. Well, how can we really know anything? And he starts by this. This is how he introduces the topic. He says, extreme skepticism and a form of philosophical skepticism that considers it impossible to believe anything. Where atheists claim that we cannot prove that God exists, an extreme skeptic would say, we can't prove that anything exists. Some would take this to imply that God exists and God's existence and non-existence are equally likely. And so here, I think is interesting of this kind of claim of, okay, what about you're talking to that person that's like, hey, we can't prove that anything exists. Therefore, hey, it's just as likely that God does exist as well as he doesn't. We can't know anything. And so this extreme skeptic, this kind of extreme agnostic of not just saying, I don't know, I would like to find out, but I don't know right now, to we actually can't know anything. And so the question is, in the face of this objection, how do we respond? Can we really know anything? And how do we know stuff? And so I want to talk through different forms of knowledge and what looks at knowledge and how we should look at knowledge and how we justify knowledge, how we justify our beliefs. And I want to address each of those kind of things throughout today's show to look at the fact that we actually can know things. We can justify our beliefs, and we can lead to claims where we can say, look, I know that this is true. I know that God exists. I know that Christianity is true. Now, he says, at its mildest, extreme skepticism raises the question of whether any particular view can be proven or considered, considered objectively correct. In its strongest form, such skepticism can lead to a total rejection of the physical world. And so obviously, I don't think anyone listening here is an extreme skeptic, as Armin is describing here, in the strongest form, that is completely rejecting all aspects of the physical world. I think maybe we are addressing some people that have this kind of what he says is a mild form of extreme skepticism, which just at least considers certain views to not be able to know anything about. Now, what I think is interesting, just to kind of take a step back, and I'll offer a few more thoughts on the book in general at the end. But what I thought was interesting is I'm not fully aware of every single argument for or against God. I'm just not. I've not heard everything that everyone has said, and none of us have. But again, when Armin Navabi says, here are 20 common arguments for God's existence, and he's going to offer the simple responses to 20 common arguments for God's existence. My thought when I started this chapter was, is this one of the top most 20 common arguments for God's existence? So I actually, it's on my other laptop. I didn't pull it up here. I went on to ChatGPT and I just went, what are the top 20 or the 20 most common arguments for God's existence? And maybe I could do this here really quickly because I left my laptop downstairs. How fast can ChatGPT pump out a result when I don't even have it open? Let's see. No, I don't want to learn more. I want to application error. Wonderful. All right, let's see if I can think and talk and try to get this all opened at the same time. There we go. Start now. What are the 20 most common arguments for God's existence? So according to ChatGPT, and I'm curious if this is similar to what came up on my other laptop about a few minutes ago when I searched this, is number one, like the cosmological argument. I think that is in Armin's book. If I look back at the different chapters, I said I was going to do this all at the end, and now I'm doing it here. But I think chapter, I don't know, actually. I don't see it here. I think it was there somewhere. The teleological argument. This was to be chapter 1 of Armin's book. The moral argument. This was chapter 4. There's also the ontological argument, one that Armin does not address. This, according to ChatGPT, is the fourth most common argument for God. Then there's an argument for religious experience that Armin does have. Arguments from Big Bang cosmology. Argument from consciousness. Argument from beauty. That was not in Armin's book. Argument from the laws of nature. That was, I think, around chapter 11 or 12, somewhere around there. Argument from the resurrection of Jesus. That was not included in this book. Argument based on the existence of the universe. Number 12, argument from evil. Number 13, argument from the impossibility of an infinite regress. Number 14, argument from the uniformity of nature. Number 15, arguments from providence. Number 16, arguments from historical events. Number 17, argument from faith. 18, arguments from providence and fulfilled prophecy. Number 19, arguments for the unity of diverse religious traditions. And number 20, arguments from human aspiration. So according to ChatGPT, those are the 20 most common arguments. So I do find it interesting if you are going to address, here are the 20 most common arguments for God's existence and my responses to them. I would just be curious why Armin would choose this argument where supposedly Christians, and he's probably heard this, if he's included it, he's heard it, to say, well, you can't know anything, therefore God exists. Or, hey, you can't know anything, well, so you can't prove there's not a God, and I can't prove there is, but I'm justified in my beliefs because you can't really know anything, and therefore you can't know it either way. This seems like, if it is being said, one of the worst arguments for God's existence, to say, I know that God exists because you can't know anything. That's just not a good argument. And so I would have loved to see Armin not just address maybe the 20 most common arguments that maybe he's heard, but the 20 maybe most widely spread arguments, or the 20 best arguments. How can we look at what the best the other side has to offer, steel man that argument, and then refute it, and then show where we think that argument goes wrong? And so that's what I would have loved to see. And that's what I started reading this chapter, and I thought, okay, maybe Christians are saying this, but this idea of, well, we can't prove that anything exists, therefore God's existence is equally likely to non-existence. It's like, okay, but that doesn't lead to really any conclusion. And so I thought it was interesting why this was included as one of the top 20 most common arguments for God's existence. Now, I do think this is a really fascinating topic because it does get into how do we know stuff? How do we get this? And how do we actually know stuff? Now, Travis jumps in here. He says, I hear this objection all the time. Okay, so I guess it is, you hear it all the time when pressing people on the reliability of faith. So I'm just curious if you want to mention when you press someone on this, and they say, I know God exists. And then you say, well, how do you know that? And they go, well, you can't know anything. I mean, then it's just self-refuting. It's not a good argument. I get people say, well, I just have faith, and they kind of backpedal if they don't have a way to justify it. And that's why I have the show, to try to justify faith. So I get some people maybe don't justify it, but I would push, if I was an atheist, I would push back against that. And if a Christian's like, yeah, God is real, you should believe in God. And you're like, how do you know? And you're like, well, you can't know anything. Well, then how do you know God is real? Well, I just have faith. So is faith a way of knowing? Yes. Well, then you can know some stuff, right, Christian? So I would push back. I just don't find this to be the best. Now, Armin jumps in, first section, it says, okay, how can we really know anything? And he says, the reason that some claim that true knowledge is impossible is because we are limited by our senses and experiences, which are ultimately subjective. We perceive reality through our senses and think about it with our brains, and it's impossible to know for sure whether these senses are actually trustworthy. All right, that's what Armin says. Yeah, I know, Travis, you didn't say it was a good argument. I'm saying Armin included it as one of the top 20 arguments that he thought was worth addressing, and that's my pushback. So Armin says this idea of, like, some people are claiming that knowledge is impossible because we're limited by our senses and our experiences, which are ultimately subjective. Now, again, I think that there are a lot of people that sometimes have this. What I have found, and I think Christians can do this, what I've found, this is also very common among atheists. I mean, look at the comment sections in my videos, and it's this, especially when it comes to morality. Just this week, I was walking through quite a few different objections from different atheists claiming that morality is not objective. I think it was posted on my short that I just uploaded this week on YouTube, talking about how do we know that morality is objective, or what does it mean for morality to be objective? And a lot of comments came in that said, morality is subjective. It's not objective. There is no objective morality. And often the question is, well, why not? And it says, well, because everything is processed through our senses and our experiences, which is ultimately subjective. And so since we perceive reality through our senses and think about it with our brains, many atheists claim this week, it's impossible to know whether our senses are actually trustworthy. Therefore, it's impossible to say morality is objective. Right? And so this, I think, claim is maybe coming from all sorts of sides to say, how do we know anything if we have to see it ourselves, and if we have to perceive it ourselves and make sense of it ourselves and process it ourselves and then explain it? And it's my brain and my thoughts and my reasoning and my stuff that has filtered everything that is coming in before it can go back out. How can I actually claim that this is objective? And I think that is a good question. And I think a really helpful point that Armin makes right here from the very beginning. Because again, I've heard this from atheists and Christians, that you can't say anything morality is objective because it's processed subjectively. Now that's true. And this is why in that short video I posted on YouTube that got all the comments is to say this: objective morality, or to say that something is objective, does not mean that it is completely independent of human thought. Well, of course I have to think about it. Of course we have to perceive, see, process, and reason through things in order to communicate them or know them. Our rationality and our subjective experience does filter everything. The question whether something you can actually know or something that is objectively true is the truth of that statement determined by the object, or is it determined by the subject? Not whether the subject has any sort of influence on it. Of course it does. But do my thoughts make it true, or is it true independent of what I think? So the common example is to say the claim like it is raining outside. Does my thinking it's raining make it rain? No, of course not. Whether it's raining or not has no bearing whatsoever on what I think about the rain or what I believe about the rain. It depends on whether the rain is actually falling from the sky. The truth of the statement, it is raining, does not depend on my thoughts. It depends on whether rain is falling outside. It depends on reality. So is reality the determiner of truth of that claim? Or is it my subjective experience or my preference, my opinion that is the determiner whether that truth or that claim is true or false? That, I think, is the big point, not just simply to say that it has been processed through my thinking and by my brain, and therefore it is all subjective. Now, Armin kind of goes on to say, okay, well, can we really know anything? And he gives a common thought experiment that I would often give to my students to say like, well, hey, maybe we live in this matrix world. He says here, indeed, it's possible that we don't even really exist, and there's no such thing as reality. We could all be brains in vats, hooked up to computer simulations like the famous movie The Matrix. Everything that you know and experience may be a lie. As the logic of this argument goes, he writes, we have no way of knowing whether we're actually brains in vats. Therefore, we have no way of knowing anything else about the world. Since this claim is in no way testable, however, we have no way of proving it and no reason to believe that it's true. He then finishes, we can only live in a reality that we can observe, not a hypothetical reality that we have no way of proving. To do so otherwise would be insane. I think this is a really helpful point in conversations about beliefs and how do we justify them. People often bring up this claim. It's like, well, what if? What if? What if? What if this is true? What if that is true? What if we're this? What if we're brains and vats? What if? What if? What if? And the question is, yeah, well, what if? I don't always know the answer to the what ifs. What if God doesn't exist? Okay, what if this? What if that? I may not know. The reality is we can only live in the reality that we can observe, not a hypothetical reality. And so people can provide what ifs, but unless they can provide justification or reason to believe that their what if is actually true, then I don't think that we have any need to bear it and to believe it. So if a Christian says, well, what if God does exist? Okay, what if he does? Can you show me that there's reasons that he does exist? Can you justify that belief? Or are you just using this hypothetical reality that you can't actually prove? I think this goes both ways, that we recognize we have to have a way to test something, just simply saying. And so I would always challenge my students and say, okay, can you prove to me that you are not created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age and memories implanted in your head? And they would say, well, you can open up my stomach and find breakfast I ate this morning. I said, that was created in your stomach. They said, oh, you can look at my phone and see pictures from yesterday. I said, those were implanted there. Right. And if we're going to use physical evidence to try to prove that you're not older than 5 minutes, created with appearance of age. You can't. Everything can be justified. We'll say, well, that was created that way. That was created that way. That was created that way. But again, do we have any reason to believe whatsoever that we were created 5 minutes ago with memories implanted in our head with the appearance of age? And the answer is no. Everything about our sense experience, everything about our reality, our minds, our thoughts, our memories points to the fact that that is not what is true. And so as Armin says here, and I fully agree, says we do not require absolute certainty about our world. And then he says, science does not claim to have absolutely certainty about the world. It creates models that provide the best explanation based on available evidence. If additional evidence is found, the model can be changed. Religious claims should stand up to the same scrutiny as scientific ones. Claims should be testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. If there's no way to test whether a claim is true, there's no reason to live as though it is. And I would agree. And here's where I want to put a quick pause on his book. And I want to address a few kind of a little rabbit trail, side trail. Here's what I think is the question is, I would agree that absolute certainty is not required in order to claim knowledge about the world. And I also would agree that what we should do, or what we often do, is we create a model that provides the best explanation based on the available evidence. And so here's my challenge to everyone. What is the best explanation based on available evidence? Right? Because what often happens when I present evidence for God, so for example, let's say we look at, okay, what is the best explanation for our designed fine-tuned universe, for these parameters? And I would say, look, information always comes from a mind. Therefore, the best explanation, there's a mind that created information in the DNA. We know that fine-tuning comes from a fine-tuner. If our universe has been designed, then there's a fine-tuner. And so you can look at this design, this information, and you can, okay, what best explains what we know right now? And often, I would say the best explanation is that there is a mind, that there is an intelligent mind, that there's a fine-tuner creator who caused all these things to come into existence. What I often get back in response is, well, maybe one day we'll find evidence that points that there's a natural explanation for all of this. Or I'm just waiting because there should be a natural explanation. And my pushback would be, okay, is that providing the best explanation based on the available evidence? Now, there are times where this objection comes up and it feels a lot like you're at a court trial, and the prosecuting attorney says, here are 10 pieces of evidence pointing to the fact that this person is guilty. There's a fingerprint at the crime scene, and there's his gun was at the crime scene, and it was fired, and there's blood on the crime, and there's all this, evidence against the victim, or not the victim, against the guy. And the defense attorney says, well, maybe one day we'll find some evidence that points to he's innocent. Maybe this has been doctored. Well, what if it was doctored? What if the video was changed? And what if this? And what if that? And maybe this was changed. And maybe one day, give us more time and we may find a natural cause of death. It wasn't actually suicide. It wasn't actually a murder. We'll find a natural explanation. Just give us more time. The question is, what should the jury do at that moment? Should the jury say, oh yeah, that's right. All those what if scenarios mean we can't know anything. We can't know whether he's guilty or innocent. And therefore, he must be innocent until proven guilty. So let's say he's innocent. Or do you say, no, you have to make a decision based on the best available evidence at that time? As he says, creating a model to provide the best explanation based on available evidence. Now, if additional evidence is found, then you can change that model. If you find something later on, you can go, oh my goodness, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Let me come back. But the question is, are we actually coming to a conclusion and providing the best explanation based on available evidence? Or are we allowing sometimes our bias to say, what if, we'll find something one day, and to withhold judgment based on a hope for future evidence that may or may not actually come? And so I think this is really interesting. Now, I know that anyone who disagrees with me, who's listening, and I'm not seeing all the comments that come in, that says, okay, well, can you provide that sort of evidence for God, like a gun at a crime scene and fingerprints and all that kind of stuff? That's not where the analogy is trying to go at this point. The point is simply, I think this is a really good point by Armin. is that we don't have to have certainty about everything. We're not asking jurors to be 100% certain without any doubt whatsoever before they can convict someone. We recognize that would never happen. We say they're guilty beyond all reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt, but beyond all reasonable doubt. And we are required to say, look, what do we know right now? Based on the best available evidence. Now, if we find something in the future, okay, we can change our mind. We can admit where we're wrong. But the question is, what do we know right now? And so the question is, how do we understand knowledge? Now, J.P. Moreland, a philosopher from Biola University, has written this wonderful book, Scientism and Secularism, Learning and Responding to a Dangerous Ideology. I read this about 6 years ago, and I interviewed back, I think, when I was podcast only, J.P. Moreland on this. So I'll post the podcast in the description below. And so the question here is, okay, how do we know stuff? Now, J.P. Moreland clarifies a few things about knowledge in general. Number one, knowledge has nothing to do with certainty, right? He agrees with Armin on that point. You do not have to have 100% certainty in order to claim that you know something. He also makes the argument that you don't actually have to know how you know something. That you can actually have knowledge and say, I know something without knowing how. So a simple thing is to say, I know that plants use light to create energy. Photosynthesis. Well, how does that work? I don't know how that works, but I know that's what's true, right? And so I don't have to know. Now, other people have studied that and know, but if I don't have to know how that's true in order to say I can know that plants use photosynthesis to create energy. The third thing that he mentions here is that one can know without knowing that you know. And he gives the example of a student who thinks, oh, I don't know anything on this test. I'm going to fail the test. I don't know these things. I don't know the answers. And then going in and actually doing quite well because he actually knew a bunch of stuff that he didn't realize that he knew. And so you can know without actually knowing you know. So you don't have to know that you know. You don't have to know how. You don't have to have certainty in order to have knowledge. Now, at the same time, he then says there are different types of knowledge. Number one, there is knowledge by acquaintance. And this is what happens when you have a direct awareness of something. Here's what J.P. Moreland says. Knowledge by acquaintance is what this happens when we are directly aware of something. For example, when I see an apple directly before me or pay attention to my inner feelings, I know these things by acquaintance. One does not need a concept of an apple or knowledge of how to use the word apple in English to have knowledge by acquaintance with the apple. A baby can see an apple without having the relevant concept or linguistic skills. Knowledge by acquaintance is sometimes called simple seeing, being directly aware of something. And so in relationship to God, Moreland says, sometimes Christians know God by directly experiencing his presence, his forgiveness, and so on. So there's this knowledge of acquaintance. Number two, the second type of knowledge, when we claim, how do we know something? How can I have a belief that I say I know this? There's what's called, he says, propositional knowledge. He says, this is knowledge that an entire proposition is true. For example, knowledge that the object there is an apple requires having a concept of an apple and knowing that the object under consideration satisfies that concept. Propositional knowledge is justified true belief. This is how we often define knowledge, as a justified true belief. It is believing something that is true on the basis of adequate grounds. And so here again, applying to Christianity, he writes, the Bible is our ultimate final source of propositional knowledge about doctrines of Christianity, that I believe something is true based on adequate grounds. Now, again, we're going to debate and argue whether those grounds actually are adequate, whether those grounds actually are justified. But that is a claim that Christians make, is I would say, I know that God exists because I believe that it is true that God exists based on appropriate evidence. Now, again, atheists are pushing back and say, well, I don't think the evidence is good. I lack a belief. I don't find that evidence good. Again, that's a disagreement. That's the pushback. The question is that evidence adequate? Are the arguments for God good enough to go through to push us over the hump to say, oh, wow, I actually believe that God exists, and here is why. Here is justification for it. Now it counts as having that propositional knowledge. Lastly is a how-to knowledge. This is the ability to do certain things, to use apples for certain purposes. We may distinguish mere know-how from genuine know-how or skill. The later is know-how based on knowledge and insight and its characteristics of skilled practitioners in some field. Mere know-how is the ability to engage in a correct behavioral movements, say by following the steps in a manual, with little or no knowledge of why one is performing these movements. And so we have biblical know-how directed knowledge at living life well. This is called wisdom. Now he goes into a lot further, and I can post this article published back in 2008 titled "What is Knowledge?" A philosophical essay. But the point here is that we have these different types of knowledge that we can know things. Now I see some questions coming in. I'll get to those here in a second. In this book, Scientism and Secularism, what J.P. Moreland is actually thinking about and writing on here in this book is a idea called scientism. Now, I think this comes up in our men's chapter a little bit, and it's come up in prior weeks. And so I want to take this opportunity to say, okay, how do we really know anything? How do we know? Well, there is a view called scientism that, roughly speaking, is defined as that the hard sciences alone have the intellectual authority to give us knowledge on reality. Now, you may agree or disagree that that is true or false, but the point is that there are some who, as Armin says, hey, there are some who hold this extreme skepticism that says you can't know anything. And then there are others that would hold to what is called scientism that says, okay, you can know some stuff, but the only things that you can know are through the hard sciences. It is the hard sciences alone that give us intellectual authority and give us knowledge of reality. Therefore, anything that is not scientifically testable, therefore cannot be counted as knowledge. So Moreland goes on and says, especially, so everything else, especially ethics, theology, and philosophy, is at least according to scientism based on private emotions, blind faith, or cultural upbringing. And so this is, I think, a form that a lot of people have, and I know I've come up against it a lot, is this idea of, okay, give me scientific evidence for God, and that's the only type of evidence that I'll accept. Or someone says, give me evidence for God. Well, what do you count as evidence? Anything that's scientifically testable, right? This is in the vein of this idea of scientism, that unless we can provide scientific reasons to believe in God, or unless it has been tested using the scientific method, therefore you can't have, or that's the only way you can have knowledge of reality. So if you're going to talk about morality, ethics, right and wrong, values, if you're going to talk about theology, views of God, if you're going to talk about philosophy, these are just your emotions. These are just your beliefs. This is just your blind faith. This is just your cultural upbringing. There's no actual good reason to believe it. Now, the two ironies of scientism, before I'm going to talk about really quickly, why does it matter? And actually the problem with scientism. He says, number one of the great ironies of all of this is that scientism is not a doctrine of science. Rather, it is a doctrine of philosophy. More specifically, scientism is actually a doctrine of epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies what knowledge is and how we obtain it. And so this idea to say you can't believe anything unless it has been scientifically proven or tested, or only science can give you knowledge, is not a scientific knowledge claim. It is a philosophical claim. He says, number two, the second irony is that scientism actually distorts science. By its very nature, science cannot claim to be the only way to know reality. And so he's going to go into that a little bit. Now, why does this matter? I want to give you a couple reasons why this matters. Why does scientism matter? Well, the reason that Christians should care about this, and now I guess I'm kind of just speaking more so to Christians, but I want to challenge the atheists who maybe believe in scientism. But number one, Christians, why should you care about this idea? It's because scientism puts Christianity outside of the plausibility structure. Moreland says this: to the extent that scientism is embraced in our culture, our morals and spiritual claims will be decognitivized. In other words, our deepest beliefs about life, knowledge, history, and reality will seem to be utterly implausible. Not just untrue, but unworthy of rational consideration. It will be like many of us that look at flat earthers and we go, hey, someone goes, I have a flat earth society meeting. Come listen to all the reasons to be a flat earther. And all of us just go, no, that's just ridiculous. Like, I'm not even, considered. It's not just like, oh, that's false, but it is unworthy of rational consideration. And this is how a lot of people are going to look at Christians, and how people do look at Christians, because of this scientistic influence that says, hey, you can only know things proven by science. These things that Christians believe are not scientific. Therefore, it just falls outside of what is even possible. What he also addresses here is he says that scientism then has also forced the church to offer a gospel simply because it works, rather than trying to claim that it's true or can be known as such, right? And so that's, I think, an interesting claim of why this matters for the church. Now, scientism has brought about several shifts in our culture. Now, I've talked about this in some of my lecture I do on science and faith. I address these points, and so you can watch that lecture video. I can post it. That goes into this further. But what we recognize is there are a few different shifts that scientism has done. Number one, we have shifted from the realm of religion and ethics from knowledge to blind faith. And a lot of even Christians have done this. I know, Travis, you talk about this a lot, is this, okay, well, if I can't test something scientifically, then I can't claim to actually know it. Therefore, when it comes to religion and ethics, this is just my blind faith. And so as a Christian, I'm just going to say, I believe it. I just have faith in this. Rather than Christians, we need to be able to step up and say, I know this. I'm actually making a knowledge claim, because knowledge can be gained in ways that are not just scientific. And therefore, even though I can't maybe prove something scientifically, doesn't mean I can't know it. He says the second shift that we've seen in our culture is not just from having knowledge about God to now we just have faith. He says we shifted from searching for truth to just the immediate satisfaction of desires, right? If I can't know true things about values and morality, the purpose of life, why am I here, these kind of big questions of life, if there's no truth in that, because those are not scientific questions, then all that really matters is, what's going to satisfy my desire? What do I want to do? What do I want to achieve? How do I want to live? And therefore, I think this radical expressive individualism starts to flow out that we read about and we hear about a lot in our culture and cultural conversations. And this is because if you're going to claim there's no truth in these big questions, then it's just, okay, well, what do you want? Rather than what is true? How should I live versus how do I want to live? In ethics, what scientism does is it shifts from a positive duty and virtue to a do no harm minimalism. Rather than saying, here's how you should live because this is objectively good and the actual purpose for which you were created, we just go, hey, just don't hurt anybody. Do whatever you want, just don't hurt anybody. So we have this do no harm minimalism versus this actual positive duty, things that we should do because these are actually right to do. A fourth shift that he talks about is a classical model of tolerance or freedom to a contemporary view of freedom, right? Rather than the ability to do or the power to do what you ought to do, what you should do, because there's a knowledge of how I was created and how I should live. If scientism is true and you can't actually know things about virtues and duties, then all you have then is I should be able to do whatever I want to do. And so, I mean, I was just talking to a high school group the other day and I asked them, how do you define freedom? And I said, many would define freedom as the ability to do whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do it. Is that freedom? And virtually everyone in the room said, yes, yeah, that's freedom. Right? We all are influenced by this idea that here's that what I do is just whatever I want because there's no actual purpose. And therefore there's no that positive duty of how I should live, the ability to do what you ought to do or you were created to do. Finally, he talks about moving from a classical model of tolerance to a contemporary view of tolerance. Rather than respecting people who disagree, the idea is if there is no knowledge, then you just say, well, everyone is equally right. And that's kind of what Armin, I think, is addressing here. So if you can't know what is actually right, if you can't know what virtues are actually good, then all virtues are kind of just equal. And therefore, tolerance means to say that everyone's right. Everyone has their view and let's just respect everyone because no one's actually right. Versus classically, you can say, no, there actually is a right and wrong. There are positive and good virtues and bad things. And tolerance then is respecting people who disagree. And so this actually is really, really important to think through on why this matters and why it's important to discuss. Now, to finish here really quickly, Moreland then in this book gives 2 reasons why scientism should not be believed. Number 1 is this: scientism is self-refuting. To make a self-refuting claim means that you affirm 2 opposite or 2 contradictory propositions at the same time and in the same sense. So for example, if you said every sentence is exactly 3 words long, well, that is a sentence. So I'm saying every sentence is 3 words long, but I'm also giving you a sentence that is longer than 3 words. That's a self-refuting claim. Or if you said, I cannot speak English, That is self-refuting. Why? I'm affirming I can't speak English while speaking English. So that is self-refuting. To say I do not exist, well, I have to exist in order to say that I do not exist. That is a self-refuting claim. This sentence is false. That is self-refuting because I'm claiming like it's true, but it's not a true sentence. It's false. And so that is self-refuting. So these are our ideas, or what it means for something to be self-refuting is that it affirms two opposite propositions at the same time in the same sense. So scientism is a self-refuting statement. We recognize if you're going to say there are no truths, you're making a truth claim. And so you can test that claim by saying, okay, is that claim true? Is it true that there are no truths? Because if it is, then that's self-refuting. And if there's not, that's self-refuting. So if we're going to test the claim, only what is testable by science can be true. Let's see if it actually fits the criteria. Does the claim only stuff testable by science can be true? Is that true? Well, the question here is, does it get tested using science? No. This claim is a philosophical statement about science that itself cannot be tested by science. And so scientism, to say you can only know things through science, is a self-refuting view. Moreland says here, the irony is that strong scientism is a philosophical statement expressing an epistemological viewpoint about science. It is not a statement of science. This is the first problem and reason why we should reject scientism. Secondly, and then I'll finish here, the scientism, he writes, is an enemy of science. So if you really do love science, you should not believe in scientism, because scientism actually is an enemy of science. It holds conclusions and presuppositions that would mean science is impossible. So here's a few that Moreland states. He says there are certain presuppositions of science that cannot be justified using science, that we have to believe are true. And therefore, if these things are true, that the things that make science possible are true, and those things themselves can't be tested by science, then you can't believe this idea that only things testable by science are true. Number one, in order to even do science itself, and a way in which, and a presupposition that science cannot justify, is the view that a world exists out there, independent of mind, language, and theory. Number two, the nature of the world is orderly, especially in its deep structure, that lies under and beyond the magnificent world of ordinary perception. So that there's an orderly world that we're studying is a presupposition of science. Number three, you have to believe that objective truth exists, right? In order to even do science, and as if science is the search for truth, then there has to be objective truth. And so the idea that objective truth exists is a presupposition, a prior belief about science that makes science possible, but has not been tested scientifically. Number four, our sensory and cognitive faculties are reliable for gaining truth and knowledge of the world, and they are able to grasp the world's deep structure that lies beyond the sense-perceptive world. So yes, while we have to use our minds, but our minds are created in a way that they are actually reliable for gaining truth and knowledge about the world. And is it possible for me to be wrong? Of course it is. But just because I could be wrong does not mean I am wrong or am always wrong. And everyone could be wrong. And so if the fact that we could be wrong means everyone is always wrong, well, then you can't know anything, and you are at the extreme skepticism that Armin Navabi talks about. But if you believe that there are at least some truths that we can know, then you have a belief that your cognitive faculties, your mind, your brain, have the ability to gain truth and knowledge in a reliable way. And that is not a scientifically proven thing. That is a presupposition that is brought to the sciences. Number five, various types of values and oughts, things that we ought to do, exists. He talks about that there are moral values, there are relational values, and there are aesthetic values. And these three values are assumptions of science that science cannot justify. Number six, and last one, the laws of logic and mathematics exist. And so even though science appeals to the laws of logic and mathematics, and thus presupposes them, it cannot justify them. So William Lane Craig has an interesting kind of conversation with Peter Atkins on YouTube. If you search like, can science prove everything? And Peter Atkins like, no, I think this, science has to prove everything. Or you ask William Lane Craig, what can you know that's not proven by science? He lists out moral values, aesthetic values, these sort of claims in science itself. So in conclusion, J.P. Moreland writes, in all this discussion, we don't miss the forest for the trees. The conclusion of science cannot be stronger than its presuppositions. There may be things that science presupposes, but science itself cannot justify those presuppositions. It needs philosophy to do that. And therefore, the philosophy of scientism, which is not itself science, ends up being an enemy to science itself. And so I think this is helpful to think through. We can know things. Yes, science is a good and wonderful way to know stuff, but it is not the only reliable way to know. And so if we are challenged to say, well, you have to provide scientific evidence for something, it's like, okay, are you saying that that's the only evidence that you'll accept? Well, then that person is holding scientism, and that's a philosophical worldview idea that I think needs to be challenged. So as we get back to Armin's ending of his chapter, he says, look, beliefs can be justified. He says our beliefs about the world, we can see the world, find evidence to then support and justify our beliefs. He says this, quote, we have no choice but to live in a reality and obey the laws that govern it as they are perceived. Even if our reality were only a simulation, there's the only option available to us. And so we base our beliefs about the world on what we can observe. And so the question is, when we look around ourselves, when we observe the world, what do we see and what explanation makes the best sense of that? And we need to have claims and beliefs that are knowledge claims that have matched our experience of the world, that can be tested using propositional knowledge, and those sort of things are important. And so he then goes on, and he finishes by saying, look, theists claiming that God exists are making extraordinary claims. This requires extraordinary evidence, and seen throughout this book that evidence does not exist. Now, I'll let you be the evaluator of that, as maybe if you want to go back and watch all 20 parts. But I don't think that Armin addressed the most strongest arguments for God. I don't think he addressed the best evidence. And I think that his arguments had some flaws in them that I tried to point out through this book and through this series. The question here is, if I'm going to make an extraordinary claim that God exists, do I need extraordinary evidence? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. Here's what I would say. You need sufficient evidence. There are some claims that are crazy. Like, I won the mega ball lottery. Like, that's an extraordinary claim. But a very simple piece of evidence will support that. Me showing you a piece of paper with the right numbers on it. Right? We just need sufficient evidence. We need a proper evidence to justify the claim that we make. And so, yes, a claim of a being existing outside of nature, who transcends reality, who created all of reality, that is an extraordinary claim. To have beliefs about miracles and people rising from the dead and Jesus rising from the dead, those are extraordinary claims. Those are not something that we see every day. But to allow someone to say that you need extraordinary evidence that is almost impossible to give. And again, this isn't everybody, but I've had those sort of conversations where it's like, what evidence would convince you? And the evidence that this is what would convince me is impossible to even match and meet. It's a burden we're unwilling to even prove. The question is that reasonable? Or is it better to say, hey, that is an extraordinary claim. Do you have sufficient evidence? Do you have evidence that points to this? Do you have evidence of a mind outside of our universe? And I think that when you look at the major arguments for God's existence, from the cosmological argument, design argument, the moral argument, the argument from consciousness, the contingency argument, the ontological argument, I think that my personal opinion, I'm not just making stuff up and I'm not just lying to you. I am honestly convinced that these arguments are good, that they're sound, that they work, and that they actually point to the fact that the best explanation for the existence of the universe, for objective moral values and duties, for the fine-tuning of our universe, for our consciousness and our minds and our ability to think and reason, the best explanation based on the current evidence that we have is that there is a God who created and designed us and gave us these sort of faculties. Now, if we're going to hold out hope and say, well, yeah, man, design looks like it points to a designer, but maybe one day we'll find a natural explanation for it. Okay. but just recognize we're not making decisions based on current evidence. We're saying, I hope, or what if sort of thing. And so that's my challenge. That's my pushback. And I honestly believe it. And so if you want to call in, again, now I'm taking calls. If you want to call in, chat, if you want to push back, I think that's where I'm at. And we can talk about all the evidence for God, but I think that we actually can know God. Christian belief is not just simply a belief. It's not a hope. It's not just a wish, but it's a knowledge where God talks about how we can know that we are saved. We can know that Jesus exists. We know that he exists. We know that Jesus rose from the dead, and we have good reason to believe it. And that's where I really would have wished that Armin would have addressed a few more of these really strong arguments for God's existence. I wish that he would have addressed the argument for Christianity. I know this isn't just a book on Christianity, but argument based on the resurrection. I think the evidence there is strong. I think there's some really good stuff that I wish that he would have done, and maybe some steel manning of the other side. So anyways, with all that said, I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm going to go back through your comments. See what sort of questions came in. Again, if you have a question, put a Q in the front so I know it's for me and not just you guys chatting in the live chat. Love to see you guys interacting and chatting with each other. But again, if you have a question, put a Q there. And then also I'm going to post the link again. If you want to call into the show, there is the link where you can call in and join as well. So with that, give me a second and I'm going to scroll through your comments. So if God has a mind, then God was created by another mind, otherwise special pleading. So the question is, how do we make sense of the immaterial aspect of us? Right? And this is not special pleading, because as what is often talked about in philosophy, and I've addressed in other shows, is that we have contingent things. This is, I think, pretty philosophically accepted among everybody. There's contingent things and there are necessary things. A contingent thing is something that relies on something else for its existence. And something that exists necessarily is it exists by the necessity of its own nature. It just has to exist. And so when we recognize that contingencies, this is the argument for God based on contingency that, again, Armin Navabi didn't discuss, is that when we have contingent things, we cannot philosophically have an infinite regress into the past of contingent things. If everything always requires something else for its existence, then you go back to infinity and you never actually have existence. So again, to think of it like this, and I played this, I don't remember which part, sorry, but one of the videos walking through Armin's chapter, I brought this up, probably it was probably the video on the cosmological argument. But J.P. Moreland talks about this idea of being of life being a contingent thing. In order for me to have life, I first have to have life given to me. So that life was given to me by my parents. And now that I have life, I can give life to my kids. Well, before I can give life to my kids, I first have to receive it from my parents. Then before my parents can give it to me, they have to receive it from their parents. And the question is, we are what J.P. Moreland calls a borrowing lender of life. In order for me to lend it, for me to give it, I first have to borrow it. If you go back and say, okay, well, my parents got it from their parents and from their parents and then from their, and you keep going back, you will never actually get to the person who just owns life, the owning lender of existence. Then you never actually have existence. Now, how I would teach this in my high school class is I would say, okay, I'd pick some kid in the front. John, you want a whiteboard marker, but you don't have one. And so you ask, Susan next to you and say, hey, Susan, do you have a whiteboard marker? And Susan goes, I would love to give you a marker, but I don't have one. Let me ask Sarah if she has one. And if I get one from Sarah, then I can give it to you. So then Susan asked Sarah, hey, Sarah, do you have a whiteboard marker? And she said, no, I'd love to lend you one, but I don't have one. Let me ask Michael. And she asked Michael. Now, if this line keeps going where no one actually has that marker to give, will John ever get a whiteboard marker? No, he will never get it. If John is holding a whiteboard marker, then at some point someone just had a marker to be able to give. And the same is true when it comes to our existence. The fact that we are contingents, that our mind is contingent, it points back to where it eventually stops, that finite beginning where someone just simply owned existence. And so the fact that we have a mind and that our mind is a contingent thing, it points back to finally the ultimate mind who just is. And so this is the argument from contingency that is at pointing as one of the arguments from God is the fact that there are contingent things and we cannot have an infinite regress of contingent things, points to the fact that there's someone who just simply owned existence, the mind behind it all, who created all other minds. And so the fact that our contingent minds exist does not mean that God's mind is also contingent and therefore requires an explanation. And that gets back to that ad absurdity. And so that's where I would kind of address that issue. And so I don't think there's that infinite regression as you put it there. All right. Searching for more of your questions. Are you treating natural and supernatural explanations as equally valid? The way in which I put this, Mirza, is, and again, I don't see callers. If anyone wants to call in, you click on the link. The question is, I would put it as, there's a natural explanation and there's an intelligent explanation. And no matter what we look at, you can say, look, this got here through intelligent explanation and this got here through natural reasons, right? And so I used to give this illustration to my students where I would, I don't know if I can pull it up really quickly, but I would show them, a rock and say natural or intelligent, say, well, this natural. And then I'd show them an arrowhead, natural or intelligent. Oh, that's intelligent, right? I'd show them, Mount Rushmore, faces in the mountain, natural or intelligent? Well, that's intelligent, clearly, right? It's like, well, what if you say, well, I need to find a natural explanation for this. How did the wind and the waves and the water and the rain erode 4 presidents' faces in the side of a mountain? You go, well, that's silly. You're never going to find that answer because that's not a natural explanation. This has an intelligent cause. Carvers, designers, creators went up there and chiseled these faces into the mountain. Now, if you go to like a desert and you see lines in the sand, you go, I need to figure out who took a rake and raked all these lines in the sand. You go, well, that's ridiculous. There's a natural explanation. Wind does this. You're never going to find someone with a rake. You don't go to the Grand Canyon and say, oh, there has to be an intelligent explanation. Who dug this out with a shovel? It's like, well, no, you can look at, plate tectonics and erosion, all that kind of stuff and say, here's a natural explanation for the Grand Canyon. But in the same way that you would never look at lines in a beach or lines in a desert and say, well, there must be an intelligent explanation. How do you make sense of this? You would never look at lines in a beach that says, I love you, will you marry me? And say, well, there must be a natural explanation. So what I would say is that natural and intelligent explanations should both be on the table when we evaluate the evidence. And we say, okay, what makes sense of this? Does it have a natural cause or does it have an intelligent cause? And which one does it point to? Now, to do that with everything in life, when we look at tables and chairs and rocks, and then to say, now we don't need that when it comes to the universe. When it comes to the universe, there's only a natural explanation possible. And therefore, there's not an intelligent explanation of our universe, of all of nature, which would be a supernatural explanation, I don't think is a reasonable jump. Now, Mirza, I see that you just called in. And so let me address what your question was and what my response there was really quickly. Welcome. How did I do at answering your question?
Hey, can you hear me?
I can. Yeah. Thanks for calling in again.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I don't know. You kind of mislabeled supernatural as intelligent, which makes no sense. I don't think you would be doing this if the intelligent so-called answer was ghosts or aliens or Bigfoot. The thing is, all these things you're talking about, how do we know things and so on? Well, there are certain guidelines. For example, things should be falsifiable. They should be testable. There's parsimony principle. There is the Occam's razor and so on. I mean, not all theories are equal. And that's one of the reasons I left Islam, is because it wasn't falsifiable. It wasn't like, if you're wrong, there's no way you can be ever proven wrong. So that's kind of what I mean. For example, let's say your car disappears, right?
Yeah.
And you go outside and you don't know what happened and you never will know what happened. And you're considering 2 possibilities. Somebody stole it or God made it disappear, right? Which one would you believe?
That if my car is missing, is my belief that someone stole it or God made it disappear? Yes. I would probably assume that someone stole it. Yeah. I mean, I would assume that someone stole it.
Why?
Because that's naturally how things function.
Exactly, right. And why? But you believe in God, and you believe in a God who can make your car disappear. So why isn't that a possibility?
Well, it's possible. I didn't say it's not possible, but you're asking me what would I first assume, and so just like
exactly right.
Well, hold on. So just like if you said my uncle rose from the dead, my first assumption would be, no, he didn't. Right? I'm going to assume based on how things naturally function and what our common experience is that he didn't. Now, do I believe that resurrections of the dead are impossible? No, of course not. Could your uncle have risen from the dead?
Right.
Sure. The question is, can you provide reason to believe it? So my natural inclination is to say, no, I don't think he did. But that doesn't mean that the other possibility is off the table completely.
So would you believe that my uncle rose from the dead?
If you could provide me reason to believe that he did, then yeah. I don't eliminate.
I saw him and other people saw him. I saw him and other people saw him. Would you believe that?
So you would have to show me what I've talked about on the show before, that your uncle was alive at point A, that he was dead at point B, and he was alive again at point C. And if you could show me that this eyewitness testimony and other factors of him actually being alive after the fact of being actually dead, then there would be reason to believe. I mean, I'm not against miracles. I'm not against resurrections. I think that people have risen from the dead, and not just Jesus.
Right. So there's actually a guru in India who was buried alive for 40 days and came out. Would you believe that? I mean, and supposedly there are witnesses and so on.
Right. So I have to look at the evidence. So my question for you, Mirza, would be, is that option even on the table for you? When you look at Jesus, is there even a possibility that he rose from the dead? Or would you come in from the perspective of saying, no, a supernatural, a miraculous intervention is not even possible. There has to be a natural explanation. Or when you look at our universe, would you say, yeah, it's possible our universe is intelligently designed, or it's possible it's a natural explanation? Let's look at the evidence and see what it says.
So the thing with that is, which you dismissed earlier, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, right? So if somebody claims that somebody rose from the dead, and even if his friends or whatever witnesses claim that, I'm not going to believe them. Now, if there's like a video evidence and doctors were there and there were big newspaper articles about it, and this was in all the scientific journals, yes, I would believe it. But just, a few guys claiming that this guy rose from the dead and flew into heaven, why would I? Right. For example, I use this example a lot. Let's say I tell you, right, yesterday I went to Dunkin' Donuts, bought a large coffee, and as soon as I took a sip, I got transported into an alien spaceship. And you say, prove it, and I give you a receipt from Dunkin' Donuts for a large coffee. Right? Would that prove it? Of course not, right? That's what the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence means.
So the reason, so I rephrase, and I'm curious if you would disagree with my rephrasing. So I rephrased it to say that extraordinary claims require sufficient evidence, that you need, and yeah, a receipt showing an alien abduction is not sufficient evidence. But like, again, saying I won the lottery, that's a pretty extraordinary claim. That doesn't happen to everybody every day. But all I need is a simple piece of paper with the right numbers. And so I think how the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence often plays out, at least conversations I've had, which is why I address it in this way, is that is often an excuse to say my threshold for what sort of evidence would convince me is so unbelievably high because what you're claiming is so unbelievable that nothing can actually ever pass that threshold. And so that's why I often rephrase it to say, let's get away from this extraordinary evidence of whatever that means and just say, you need sufficient evidence. If you're going to make a claim, you need to have evidence that actually supports and justifies that claim.
Right. So how would like a witness testimony to something miraculous be sufficient? Because people can lie, they can be mistaken, and so on.
Right. So let me ask you this: are witness testimonies ever used in criminal courts today?
Yeah, sure.
Why would they?
They're unreliable, but yeah, sure.
If that witness can lie, then why? And if they're unreliable, why do we even have witnesses testify?
Because it's not an extraordinary claim. Right. Somebody murders somebody. That's not an extraordinary claim.
Well, I mean,
somebody came back to life. That is an extraordinary claim.
But we're questioning whether we're going to throw this person in jail for a while. I mean, that's a pretty weighty claim. Why would we make that decision based on an unreliable witness?
That's like asking, why would you assume that God did not make your car disappear? Because that's not what usually happens, right?
Yeah. So, okay. So, by the way, I want to kind of stick on topic because you've been one who said, hey, you need to make your calls shorter. And I do have another caller here. So I do want to do that. So I just want to make sure we're on topic. Yeah. But what you claimed is this idea of eyewitness testimony. And look, I've done interviews with like J. Warner Wallace, who's a cold case homicide detective, and detectives have ways of talking to eyewitnesses and doing a pretty good job of pressing them to see if their stories make sense, if their stories line up, if their stories are credible, reliable. I mean, detectives aren't just throwing anybody up on the stand and says Joe Schmo says that he committed murder, therefore there you go. I mean, these people have been vetted and tested, and there's ways to do this to make at least to be more confident that they are reliable. And so the question is, if eyewitness testimony is completely unreliable, then no jury would ever believe anyone that's sitting up on a stand. But the fact is, I think we can take eyewitness testimony, confirm it to other details as well, and allow that to be a piece of the evidence.
There are people who've been convicted and who admitted because they were coerced into it, and then they got exonerated later. I mean, so it's really unreliable eyewitness evidence and so on. I also had another question. Right. So the Armin's book is talking about the fallacy of we can't know everything and so on, right? Do you feel like you're doing that now, especially when you're saying, well, science can't know everything, therefore God could exist, right?
Isn't
that the argument he's addressing? Right. So, but you don't think that God should be for scientific scrutiny, that we should demand proof for God?
No, I think we should. I think we should demand proof and evidence for God. My argument is that the only type of evidence that should be allowed to be offered is not only scientific evidence. I don't know if I just said that rightly, but if someone is going to say you have to prove that God exists and you can only use scientific evidence, I don't think that's fair. I think my view of epistemology, how we know what we know, is that we have knowledge, and that knowledge is through science, but there's also other forms of knowledge, like experience, like knowledge by acquaintance, like history, like these other facts that can all be put together to create beliefs that we have. And so when I think we should scrutinize and say, how do you know that God exists? But I'm saying that a scientific answer should not be the only reliable or accepted form of evidence provided.
But with God, we are specifically talking about something that exists and has material influence in the real world. That's really, it's not history, it's not philosophy, it's not, we're literally talking about physical reality. So why not, have that under scientific scrutiny?
Right. So that's where I would use arguments like the design argument that points to God's effects on the physical world, creating and fine-tuning our universe. I would point to the cosmological argument. That would be more of a scientific argument, looking at the scientific evidence for the beginning of our universe and how do we best explain that. So I think that we can look at scientific evidence and then build philosophical arguments based on that evidence that point to God. But when we're also making a case for Christianity, like Jesus' resurrection, that's not something that's necessarily scientific. That's a historical fact of whether Jesus died and rose from the dead. And so I think there's different ways in which we can justify the beliefs that Christians have based on what that belief is. Scientific evidence can be one way. It's not the only way.
Right. I won't keep you any longer. I know other people are eager to talk.
Yeah, well, hey, if you want to call back in, yeah, absolutely, Mirza. It's so good to talk to you. If you want to call back in and kind of get your back in the queue, you can for sure do that. But I appreciate the call.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Mirza. Again, I think that's important. Is my point in the original question was, when we're talking about how all of the universe, how all of nature came in, we're talking about a supernatural explanation. But another way in which I try to, I think, make it more simple is intelligent cause or natural cause, and are both of those available on the table? Could it be something miraculous? Could it be something natural? Now, which way does the evidence point? And therefore, we're trying to do the best we can at following the evidence that we have. So with that, let me jump over to our next caller here. Lou, what's on your mind today?
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Yep.
So I'm talking into my Alienware computer, so I'm hoping you hear me okay.
I can, and it looks like it's coming through, so I assume everyone else can hear you too.
Good. Just stumbled across your conversation.
Okay.
And wanted to ask really just two questions.
Yeah.
One would be, with what you have been speaking about, this evidence, right? You're talking about a certain type of evidence. all right, versus scientific evidence, all right. And of course, there are different types of evidence, so I'm not disagreeing with that at all right. But the evidence that you are offering, right, would that apply to just the Christian God, or would it apply to any God? Right? Because it seems like what you're describing would apply to any God whatsoever.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I don't think it applies to any God. So let's just focus. So one of the main arguments for the Christian God, at least, would be the cosmological argument that says that God is the best explanation for everything that begins to exist, right? You know, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And you look at the qualities and attributes of our universe and point back to the cause of all physical things. So I think that argument would be consistent with at least like the gods of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. I don't think the polytheistic gods of Greek and Roman mythology would fit, because those gods are gods within the universe. Those are created gods. Those are gods that are in the sea or in the sun or those sort of things, versus a contingency argument or a cosmological argument is actually pointing to a God who transcends all of physical reality and is the creator of all the physical stuff. And so I don't think that those sort of arguments would apply to any God. It would point to only the gods who are claimed to be transcendent beyond the physical time-space reality that we know of.
Well, I don't know about all the gods, right? But the gods I have heard about, they were transcendent, right? So it's not just the Christian God that's transcendent. Like you said, Islam has a God.
Yep.
That would be transcendent. All right. And the cause in the cosmology that you were describing, the cause that you're describing, it doesn't define that cause. That cause could literally be anything. Right. And that to me is what I don't understand the proof of it. Mm-hmm. Like, I understand it being a nice story and it's philosophical and it's intelligent. It makes you think a whole lot. Okay, so I get that. But actually, it seems like at the end of it, the premise of there being something that causes another thing, let's say a universe or an earth, to come into being, we're not defining it through that argument. It could literally be anything. Right.
Okay, so would you agree that if the cause is the cause of the physical space-time universe, then that at least does narrow down the what the cause could be? So, for example, how the argument normally goes is, if all physical stuff, if all matter came into existence at the Big Bang, then whatever caused all physical matter cannot be made of physical matter, because that cause is the creator of physical things. Therefore, the cause has to be immaterial or non-physical. If the cause created all of space, then the cause itself has to be spaceless. If the Big Bang is the beginning of time and the cause of our universe created or brought into time into existence, then that cause has to be timeless. The other arguments would be that in order to create an entire universe, bring an entire universe into existence, the cause would have to be extremely powerful to create all of the energy and power within our universe. And lastly, in order to actually cause something to happen, to go from non-existence to existence, it requires a personal agent. Things like the laws of nature, like gravity, just keep something a certain way. So if it's always below freezing, then you always have frozen. But in order to go from non-existence to existence, it actually requires a personhood or an agent causation that points to our cause of our universe being personal. So that's how it normally kind of gets laid out, is if this cause can cause something to go from non-existence to existence, and the thing that it causes is our entire universe of space, matter, and time, then that points to the cause being transcendent, but also being immaterial, timeless, spaceless, powerful, and personal. So those at least be some attributes that can be logically deduced based on understanding what did this thing cause. Does that make sense?
I could follow to a point.
Okay.
I mean, what I'm missing is this cause. I'm focusing on that because I would agree there's a universe, there's things that we observe, So I'm not debating that at all. I'm talking about this cause that is supposed to have brought this into being, right?
Right.
All right. That cause, first off, I'm not a scientist at all. All right. So for me, I wouldn't know if that's even true. I have no idea. But assuming it's true, right? Assuming that there is a cause, I still don't see you defining what that cause is other than it's immaterial. Okay, maybe. And I'll say, okay, let's go there. It's immaterial. All right. It's the things you define. That's not bringing it down to a particular God, at least that I could see. There's no proof you're offering for the Christian God or the Islamic God or even a God of my own imagination. I mean, I could make anything a God and can fit into that argument.
So would, though, the God of your
I could take my
imagination,
God as an example, just to show, I could say my God is called, Aloysius, and Aloysius is immaterial, and you could go through the same thing, and I could say, look, it shows that Aloysius is the God, and I would be wrong. I would be wrong because I don't think Aloysius is the God. All right, but you seem to be going through that argument and then saying, well, that means the Christian God, but it doesn't.
okay, so that's a really good clarification. So what the argument simply shows is that there is a transcendent immaterial cause. That's it. Right. And so I'm not saying,
and I'm going to go there, and I'm saying, okay, let's say there is, right? I don't know that. I'm accepting that you somehow know that. All right. I don't, but maybe you do. All right. So I'm going there. So now there is this immaterial thing that caused this. That still is far from proving a particular God.
Oh, absolutely. So what I'm trying to walk through right now with you is that your first question is, you said, doesn't the evidence you provide point to any God? Couldn't that be evidence for any God that exists? And so my first point is, well, no. What's that?
It seems like I could make up a God right now that would fit that criteria.
Well, okay, but so here's what I'm trying to say is, what we're trying to discuss is what is true about reality, and making up something in my mind doesn't mean that is what is true about reality. So I could say, well, I think you drove to the store in a chair. Well, chairs don't drive. It's like, well, my chair in my head does drive. And William Lane Craig has an interesting interaction. I forget with who, on YouTube, but he says, I think it was Peter Atkins as well, where he says, well, Peter Atkins goes, well, I think it was a supercomputer that created our universe. And William Lane Craig goes, right. Well, but he goes, but we recognize that the cause transcends our universe. He goes, oh, this supercomputer is transcendent. And he goes, okay, but we recognize the cause is non-physical. He goes, well, this supercomputer is non-physical. And eventually what you recognize, and what William Lane Craig points out is, okay, well, you're no longer talking about a supercomputer anymore. You are speaking of God, but just calling it a supercomputer. Just like if I said, well, I drove to this store in my chair, and you go, what do you mean chairs don't drive? Well, this chair has wheels, and this chair has a steering wheel, and this chair has an engine, and this chair has this. And you go, well, then we're no longer talking about chairs. You're talking about a car, and you're just, for whatever reason, and I don't know why, you're calling a car a chair. But the issue is not what is in your mind.
I think, this is weird because I more relate to that as being more like true. Like, yes, there are things that I can comprehend that may be possibly that cause. All right. And I can make that cause anything I want in my mind. Right. I could say it's a supercomputer. I could say it's a car. I could say it's, an invisible car, a transcendent car, whatever. But just saying that this cause to prove there is a cause, it seems like you would have an eternity to go to prove that is what you describe as the cause.
Right. Okay. So what and I think this is good. And this is why I would argue that there is a stepping stone sort of process to this. So I would look at, and I'm not a cosmologist either. I would look at, other famous cosmologists. So Stephen Hawking, for example, atheist cosmologist, talked about how almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. You have Alexander Vilenkin. I know he's done a lot of stuff that people want to throw around, but he says, and he has a quote where it says, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And so based on current evidence in Big Bang cosmology, and again, maybe we prove this wrong one day, but based on current evidence, you have very famous non-Christian scientists saying, look, virtually everyone now believes that time itself and the universe had a beginning at the Big Bang. And so then we have to say, okay, well then what caused the Big Bang? How did it happen? And that's the question that people are trying to then answer. So what I'm trying to say here then is to answer your first question. So that's why I would claim that there is a beginning of our universe. I would point to the scientific evidence that convince someone like Stephen Hawking that there's a beginning of the universe, to the fact that there's a beginning. And then we ask this question, okay, what best explains the bringing into existence of our entire universe? And so as I'm agreeing with you, this, or at least what I'm trying to say is, then the logical conclusion of what could have brought in our universe is a personal being who is powerful, immaterial, spaceless, and timeless. Now, that is not true of any God, and that's not even true of whatever I can conceive of in my mind, because whatever I conceive of in my mind is mind dependent, not something that is transcendent to the universe, because the God that's in my mind only exists in my mind. The question is, what is that thing that it transcends and is outside of my mind in the universe itself that exists in reality? Now, is that any God? Well, no, that's not Poseidon. That's not Osiris. That's not Mithras. That's not these other gods that were believed in history that were created beings, because this God is not the creator, or they're not created, but is the creator. Now, is it possible that there are other gods that this fits? Yes. As I mentioned, God of Christianity, God of Islam, God of Judaism. So then the question is, okay, now how do you get to Christianity? Now, that is where, for me, and I've talked about on other shows, that it points down or comes down to, if there is a transcendent personal cause of our universe, the question then is, has this personal cause of our universe ever revealed himself or herself to us? Has this cause ever done anything to say, here I am? And that would then point to the evidence for the reliability of the Bible and the evidence for the resurrection, where Hebrews talks about Jesus is the image of the invisible God, where the Christian claim is that Jesus Christ is God who took on flesh to reveal God to us. Then he died and rose from the dead, and we have historical reason to believe that, then confirming that this is the God who created the universe. And so that's where the next step goes to where you're asking about, is it would then come down to evidence for the reliability of the Bible and the evidence for the resurrection, to show that the God who created all things then revealed himself to us, namely in the person of Jesus and throughout the words of Scripture. And that's how I would get to why the Christian God is true and not any God that's out there.
Okay, so we agree that that argument is not defining who this God is, or even if it's a person, it's just describing some sort of cause. So we, I think, agree on that.
The cosmological argument, yes. Yep.
Okay, so then it would go to, I would have to ask, and I would love to know this, if there is any evidence for a God that would be something I could digest. I mean, I don't, or comprehend. I mean, I have never seen a God. I've never touched a God. I've never felt a God. I've never heard a God. But I have thought of a God. All right. So God for me would be abstract. It's conceptual, right? And I could conceive of gods, and people have written about gods, and I can adapt their writings. I could say, oh, that makes sense to me. I like that God, or I don't like that God. But do you have any actual evidence for there being a God?
So let me ask you this. What do you mean by actual evidence?
Something I could comprehend, and something that would be enough or substantial to just a simple mind like my own. I mean, I don't know what it would be.
Yeah.
I know that I'm talking about me personally. I have never seen a God. I've
I
never
haven't
heard
either.
from a
I
God.
haven't either.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never heard from a God. I've never encountered a God. I don't know of anyone who has ever encountered a God. What I do encounter is people who talk about what they think about a God. That I've encountered. All right. And I have thought about a God a lot. Right?
Yeah.
But that's not enough for me. I want
Yeah.
something real.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have about 6 minutes left in the show. And so let me kind of say this is, have you heard arguments or have you been presented evidence for the reliability of the Bible or for the evidence for the resurrection that if that evidence is good and goes through, that would point to, if the Bible really is reliable, the Bible claims that God is speaking and saying, here I am. And he's revealing himself to us in the Bible. And so have you been presented evidence for the Bible or evidence for the resurrection that I think would be evidence that does support the thing that you're asking for?
All right. I have read, all right, most of, well, not most, because there's so many, but I've read Christian apologists. I've read, going back, this is a long time ago. I'm pretty old. I'm 62 years old. But I read Norman Geisler, Walter Martin. I've seen Lee Strobel, Josh McDowell, Sean McDowell. All right, so I've encountered these apologists who claim they have evidence of the resurrection. Okay, you may find that very compelling or very good.
Yeah.
Right? I think a lot of people do, but honestly, for myself, I find it very non-persuasive.
Okay.
Right?
Do you have a reason why you don't find it persuasive? Is there something about the evidence that just isn't persuasive to you?
It's like when you talk about eyewitnesses, this would be just one thing that's not persuasive to me. A lot of people are persuaded by Paul saying, well, there was 500 eyewitnesses that seen the resurrected Christ, right? I've heard a lot of apologists use that, right? But I'm too deep thinking or critical maybe to think that actually is real evidence that I would find compelling, because you don't have eyewitnesses. You have a book that's thousands of years old that speak of eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses are people we cross-examine. They're people we get to talk to. All right. They're not stories in a book. All right. If I said, I have a story about Spider-Man, and in that story, it says there were 8,000 people that seen him. All right. That's not an eyewitness. That's a story. Okay?
Right. So that's the question
if I could talk to someone and cross-examine people, that to me would be an eyewitness. That's what an eyewitness in court is. An eyewitness isn't a story of eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
It's actually someone who's there. So it was thousands of years ago, I can't do that. And all I have to go by is a story. That's what I see.
Yeah. So how would you apply that to other ancient historical facts? Even something as Abraham Lincoln being shot or George Washington. Those sort of facts. You can't go back and interview the eyewitnesses that are making these sort of historical claims of what happened 300 years ago. Can those be counted as eyewitnesses? Can those documents be trusted? Or would you actually say, I am skeptical of all history that is past my personal ability to investigate?
Right. My personal ability is important to me. Okay.
Yeah.
May not be. My personal ability is not everybody's. Everyone has their own standard, right? Some people believe anything. I know plenty of people would believe anything. Okay. But I'm very skeptical. So I'm not one who believes anything. All right.
Right.
Abe Lincoln, I don't interview the people who saw Abe Lincoln. So yes, I don't know that. But I look at a lot of factors other than the eyewitnesses. All right. Because you're right. I can't go back and talk to these people or examine them. All right. So there's some history that I accept. Now, you could say, why do I accept that history and other history I don't? And my answer would be, some history is reasonable. When you're talking about people rising from the dead, talking snakes, talking donkeys, that is what you were talking about before. It's kind of extraordinary. We're not talking about a guy shooting someone, all right? You're talking about something that is really wild. In my, talking donkeys, wild, way out there, all right?
So I'm sorry, I have 1 minute.
That someone's seen a talking donkey, I'm not believing that. Now, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Understand? Yeah. It may have happened, all right? But personally, I'm not believing that. No.
So if I could ask you, because I just hit 3:00, which means I do need to end. You mentioned there's stuff that's reasonable. Would you say that these sort of things are unreasonable? Or as I kind of put it, it's not like it's unreasonable. I think it's possible. It just is not what normally takes place. And so I think there's that question of, is it impossible to have talking snakes and talking donkeys and these sort of things, people rising from the dead, versus is it expected? Is it happening every day? I think those are two different questions of to say, yeah, it's not likely, it's not, or it's not common, but it's not like it's unreasonable or impossible. And so my question would be this:
almost nothing is impossible.
Okay. So then, with that being said, what
I don't know, but I would say almost nothing is literally impossible. But I look at it as likelihood, and I make decisions on what I believe based on what I think is likely. Do I think a donkey talked? I don't think so. Yeah. Right? Do I know is there evidence a donkey talked? No. So it's a belief. I could choose to believe a donkey talked, or I could choose not to. I choose not to. It doesn't make sense to me. All right.
So now, let me ask this, because I'm over time, Lou. Let me just ask you this, if I can, really quickly. When it comes to these sort of beliefs, so what would you accept as, because we're talking about, okay, let's just talk about the not talking donkeys or whatnot. Let's just talk about the resurrection of Jesus. This is obviously an event that happened 2,000 years ago. You can't go back. You can't talk to eyewitnesses. Is there any evidence that one could point to that would convince you that this took place? Or would you say, no, based on your evaluation or your way in which you evaluate history and approach history and form your beliefs about history, it would actually be impossible for me to prove that? Or would you say, if you could show me X, then I would believe that Jesus rose from the dead?
For me to believe something like a man rose from the dead would be very difficult. I don't even know what it would be. It's not going to be a story, though. That's not going to convince me. It's not going to be someone who said they seen that. I mean, people are all over the place saying they were captured by aliens and they were abducted. And those people you can speak with, all right? I don't believe them, okay? I don't buy it, all right? So, I don't even know what it would be for somebody to convince me of that. But if it's there, if there is something, I'm open to it. I would listen to any argument that's going to tell me that a man rose from the dead. All right, I would hear it out. All right, but a story that someone wrote something thousands of years ago.
Yeah, so I do have to run, and so I don't have time to go into this, and I'll give you the last word. I just don't think that the biblical account is simply just a story. I think that's why there's a cumulative case approach to this, where we say, look, this is not only a story that was written, but we have multiple accounts of it being written. We then have these accounts being accepted early by the people who were there. This message first spread in Jerusalem, the people that actually knew whether this took place or not. And so it's not just some random person saying, I was abducted by aliens. This is like the Twin Towers, falling. This is like, this took place in a city, and everyone also in that city is also believing that story, and being changed by it. And so there's other factors factors we look at to see, is the Bible as a whole reliable? And there's evidence pointing to that. This story is contained in the Bible, which would by definition mean it is reliable if the Bible as a whole is reliable. Then we look at, again, there's multiple stories. These stories are attested by external evidences and facts. I don't think that's true of your alien example. These stories are early accepted by the people who were there. That's not true of the alien example. And so I think to equate the story of Jesus rising from the dead as seen in scripture as being equal to that of an alien abduction story, I just don't think is the same. I think that there is a bigger case or a greater case or other factors that we can look into. Again, I don't have the time to get into all of that now as I'm 4 minutes over my time, but I do think that there's at least a difference there that has to be evaluated. Do you have a final thought on that?
My final thought would be, I think it's equally as likely that people were abducted by aliens. I would rate that a little more likely, all right? Because I could speak with these people. They do offer some, evidence that's weak. I don't accept it, but they offer something. The people rising from the dead thing just seems like fairy tale to me. All right, now, I'm not going to say it's impossible because, like I said, I don't think, anything is possible. I could be out of my mind right now. That's possible. All right. But being someone who values rational thinking, for me to believe people rise from the dead is far out. All right. So the proof would have to be kind of strong. The proof cannot be for that a guy wrote about it. All right.
Yeah.
Because that's just not good enough for me.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Hey, well, Lou, I appreciate you calling in. Next week, I'm going to do a full entire show, all hour and a half devoted simply to questions. So if you want to call back in and chat further about any of these details, I'd be happy to talk to you then, as well as anyone else who's listening. So, hey, Lou, thank you.
And I'm going to subscribe now, so maybe I get your feed,
Hey, I appreciate that. Thank you, Lou. I love it when people who strongly disagree want to subscribe and continue having these conversations. That's my goal here, and I love it.
And I
love hearing that. It's encouraging.
Being a gentleman. Appreciate
it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right. You too.
All right, everybody. Again, that's the end of the show. Thank you for being here. I so appreciate it. I hope this has been encouraging and challenging. This is a fun book to walk through. Hopefully the series is good. It's always up on YouTube. There's 20 parts if you want to go back to any of those parts. Again, next week, I'm going to tell you more about what next year is going to look like. And that's my only planned part, is just to say, here's what I want to do next year. Here's some other books that I want to walk through to engage in certain different conversations. And then the rest of next week is going to be devoted to your questions, your objections, your calls. And so you can start sending those in. You can follow on social media at Ryan Pauly 3. You can subscribe to make sure that show comes up, and then you can start sending in your questions, whether it's through comments or be ready for next week at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday. Again, I want to just remind you that there is a year-end challenge campaign where I'm trying to raise $14,000 to match $14,000 that has been pledged by donors. This $28,000 will go to really fund this ministry for the next year, allowing me to continue to produce shows and buy books and research and study for these shows and to try to help present a case for Christianity and engage in these sort of conversations. So if you've learned from this, if you've benefited from this, if you're encouraged by it, and you want to continue to foster these sort of conversations, these sort of dialogues between people that agree or even disagree, I would encourage you to consider donating to this cause. think-well.org/donate is where you can do that. There's different ways you can give online or by mail, and so you can get all that information there. Thank you so much for being with me today. Other videos will pop up over here on a wide range of other issues to help you think well about the Christian faith and about culture, so you can be the ambassador that God has called you to be, or you can engage with ambassadors if you are not a Christian here. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Thanks for all the interaction. Love you guys, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Continue thinking deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. See you next week, everybody. Bye.